All right, so let's get started. Again, welcome to our webinar this morning. We're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics using Safran Risk. My name's Ian Nicholson. I'm VP Solutions at Emerald Associates. I'm a risk analysis trainer and consultant. I've been conducting risk analysis in many industries for many years, more years than I'd like to count, actually. I started working with schedule risk analysis when my company became the reseller for PertMaster in Canada in 2001. Joining me today is Mary Lynn Backstrom, who's an implementation specialist with Emerald Associates. Mary Lynn has many years of experience as well. And Mary Lynn also does risk analysis training as well as P6 consulting and training. So why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, risk analysis really helps project teams and executives understand and manage the risks to their project. It gets the project team discussing the challenges of the project, keeps the project team focused on the right issues. The thing with projects is we may have many near critical paths, and we need to understand which ones may actually come back and impact the project and which ones we can probably ignore. It is a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes, but what we really want to do is we really want to understand the dependencies between the cost and schedule and help our project teams be more successful in delivering their projects. Um, I'm in Alberta, Canada, and up here we have a group called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and they study all the mega projects being done in this part of the world. One of the things that they found in one of their studies was that project risk assessment has been shown to significantly reduce project cost growth. So ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed estimates? Well, of course you do. But the thing is, the chances of meeting your project schedule and financial goals are still typically not that great. So how can that be? Well, we do detailed CPM scheduling. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, the first thing is that data is entered as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainty. So we'll say, it's going to take 3 people, 4 days at $100 an hour to do that particular task. Well, the problem with that is that's all well and good when we're sitting in an office, in an engineering office, putting together a high level schedule. It's a little different when we're sitting in the middle of a blizzard up in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and the temperature is minus 35, and those 3 people can't be outside for more than 15 minutes at a time before they get frostbite. Um, so we need to think about what could happen on our project, which could actually impact those assumptions. The other things, assumptions change over time. We make assumptions about productivity. We make assumptions about conditions. Sometimes we plan the whole project will be completed in the summer, and of course, due to the delays and approvals and everything else, everything gets pushed to the winter. Sometimes our assumptions don't match reality. It's quite often what happens is people, assume that a project is going to scale up easily, and maybe it doesn't, or they assume certain productivity factors which aren't realistic. The other thing is the project changes over time. The project scope can change, the time frame can change, the conditions can change. And all of these things have an impact on our project. And again, 2 years earlier, when we developed a detailed CPM schedule, we made some assumptions that may or may not be reality in the field. Now, we do detailed at cost estimates. Of course we do. But sometimes our estimates are too optimistic or too pessimistic. Our bid process encourages aggressive estimates because if we don't get the job, you know, how are we going to make any money? So, we try and figure out what our competitors are going to bid and we try and get a lower bid in so we can land the work. Sometimes the opposite happens. Estimators start adding their own contingency because if they put a contingency line item in the estimate, someone immediately removes it. So they start hiding things here and there. Um, Sometimes estimates are built on historical experience that's no longer valid. Technology is changing constantly. The workforce is changing constantly. And the types of projects we're doing are also changing constantly. And sometimes estimates may not scale to match the project. A lot of times what happens is we have an estimate that's built based on a pilot plant that we built 5 years ago, and now we're building the production facility, which is 50 times larger, and we've just scaled our estimate. We haven't actually gone back to see whether that's a realistic way to build an estimate. And all these items are what we call deterministic items. So what's the problem with that? Well, they don't take uncertainty into account. Uncertainties can also build on one another to make the project very different from what we originally envisioned. The classic example is there's uncertainty in everything that we do. I can tell you that on a good day, it takes me 15 minutes to drive to work, but on a bad day, it might take me 30 minutes to drive to work. And before the pandemic, I drove to work every single day, or every single weekday anyway, hopefully not too often on the weekends. But the thing is, I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take me to drive to work, even though I do it every day. But I can tell you it's going to take me 18 months to build this $2 billion refinery. It's just not always realistic. So historically, there was no easy way also to put our cost uncertainties together with our schedule uncertainties. So what would happen was we'd say, okay, we need to build a probabilistic schedule model, and we need to build a probabilistic cost model. And we'd work in complete isolation and never link the two together. Or if we did, we'd do it at a very high level where we'd say, okay, here's the results of our schedule model. Let's put them into our cost model and rerun the cost model. Um, and it was very difficult to tie the two together, even though we know that cost and schedule are linked, and there's no real easy way to break them apart on a project. Again, going back to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, on average, Alberta-based mega projects experienced a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. So again, these things are very tightly linked. And what we really need is we need a linked together probabilistic cost and schedule risk model. Now, so we need to be able to model our schedules more accurately. We need to be able to limit our financial exposure. We need to have reproducible results. So we need a methodology and an audit trail. We need improved likelihood of project success. We need confidence in our results. We need buy-in from our team members. We need to get an increased maturity in conducting our risk analysis. And what we really want to do is store all of that in one common database. So the solution to all of that is Safran risk analysis. It lets us put ranges on our estimates. It lets us model key risk events. It lets us build an integrated cost and schedule model. Okay, so it lets us do all of these things to allow us to understand the probability of achieving our end date goals, both for date and for costs. It helps us understand key drivers of the project and their effects. It helps us run different scenarios. Again, going back to this idea of everything's on one database, we don't have multiple files floating all over the place with different scenarios in them that we can never remember which one was which was always a problem in the days when I worked with PERTmaster, which became Primavera Risk Analysis. We have tens or hundreds of different files for different scenarios, and all with kind of cryptic naming on them, and we could never remember which one was which, or we could never find them 2 months later. The other thing we need to do is we need to be able to go in and run those scenarios to understand our mitigation strategies and understand, is this strategy going to be effective or not? Is it cost effective? Is it schedule effective? And we need to be able to do that kind of analysis. All right, so let's take a look. What we're going to do is we're going to dive into the tool. I'm just going to flip over to my screen share. Okay. So the first thing is when I come into Safran Risk, I get the welcome screen, which allows me to open up my projects. Now, in here, I do have the ability to import risk models. So I can import files from Primavera P6. I can import files from Safran. I can import files from Microsoft Project. Once I've got them in there, I can actually start building my model. I can then export them if I need to as well back to those tools. I also have the ability in here to change the tabs that I see across the top of the screen. Now, the way the system is set up is essentially my analysis starts on the left and moves left to right. So I'm going to work through these tabs as we go through this demonstration and talk briefly about each one and what they do. I also have some options in here where I can do things like I can edit my risk calendars. I can go in and I can set up a global risk dictionary, which I can use in all of my projects. So I can change the tabs that I'm seeing or not seeing depending on what I need for my analysis. So let's start working our way through these and let's talk about Safran Risk. I have a project open now. It's a pretty simple project. It's a UAV prototype, an unmanned air vehicle prototype. It's just a simple file that comes with the demo package of Safran. Now, this particular prototype, we got to build the thing, we got to test it, and we got to get to market. So first thing is we have the ability to create risk calendars. Now, risk calendars are essentially what we used to call probabilistic calendars in PERTmaster or Primavera Risk Analysis. And the idea here is I can define for any period of time the likelihood that I'm going to lose a working day or period of days. So, if I'm working in the winter, I can model it to say there's going to be a certain number of lost days due to cold weather. If I'm in hurricane season in the Gulf, I can go down and say I'm going to lose some blocks of time due to hurricanes, and I can build all of these in and assign them to my schedule, so that I can more accurately define when I'm potentially going to lose some time in my schedule. Now, I define these globally so I can share them across all of my projects. And this is really useful because if you've got a whole bunch of projects in the same geographic area, those probabilistic calendars are probably going to be the same for all of those projects you're working with. All right, so the next tab I have is my schedule tab. Now Safran Risk Analysis is built on the Safran scheduler platform. Okay, and so it has all of the functionality that you would get in the Safran scheduling tool. So you can go in and you can edit your logic. You can look at where the activities land. You can change anything that you need to change. You can add activities. You can remove activities. So if, for example, you needed to add a hammock activity, you could do so to monitor a particular block of risk that you're worried about. Um, so you have all of that functionality that you would have in a scheduling tool. So you don't necessarily always have to go back to Microsoft Project or Primavera P6. You can actually work directly in this tool if you want to make small changes to your model. Um, if I'm happy with this, I can move on. I'm going to move on to my Schedule Warnings tab. Now, one of the things that we have to be concerned about when we're dealing with risk analysis is that we need to have a very robust schedule in order to do risk analysis. As one of my mentors used to say, scheduling is garbage in, garbage out. Schedule risk analysis is garbage in, toxic waste out. And so we need to have a good, robust schedule. And we have in Safran the ability to look at all of the issues around our schedule in this Schedule Warnings tab. And we can tell the system what we want to monitor. And you can, in fact, get the full DCMA 14-point checker in Safran Risk. So if you want to run the full DCMA check, you can do so. Right now, I just have the basic checker on, which is essentially checking the things that are likely to be an issue during my risk analysis. I can turn them on or off. I can change some of the options. It also gives me a link that I can go immediately to any particular activity. So for example, if I want to go and look at this activity here, which has a lag on it, I can click on the icon and it'll take me right to that activity. I can review it, make sure I'm happy, fix the problem if necessary, and then I can go back to my schedule warnings and that will be removed. So I have the ability in here to very quickly go through and work through that list of issues and make sure I'm comfortable that I've got a solid schedule. So the next thing is we have the project risks tab. Now the thing about project risks in Safran is that um, it puts all of our risks together in one place. So for those of you that used Primavera Risk Analysis, you had a risk register, but that only handled risk events. Um, Whereas in Safran, we put all of our risk events and all of our uncertainties into this module. And then, so it allows us to put everything in one place and manage it in one place and then assign it to our activities or our costs as required. So for example, if I look at this first item here, which is my ash cloud, I can see on this, let me just open up this slider a little bit. I'm going to move my columns over. There we go. Okay, so in this case, we've got this risk of an ash cloud. So in our UAV prototype project, we have to do some testing and we have to fly this thing. And there's a possibility that there'll be an ash cloud, in which case we can't fly. There's a 40% probability that that's going to occur. It's a standard risk type, and we have different risk types in here. We have standard risks, we have estimate uncertainty risks, and we have calendar risks. So a standard risk is a risk that has a probability of occurrence that can be between 0 and 100%. In this case, it's 40%. And for this item, we can also define what the schedule impact of that item is going to be. So in this case, if it happens, we have a triangular distribution impact of 100, 100, 165%. So what that's saying is 40% of the time this is going to fire, and on the activities that it's assigned to, it's going to delay us somewhere between 100 and 165% on those activities. Now those impacts can be relative, or I can define them as an absolute impact, in which case I can define exactly how many days that impact is going to add to my activity. So I have the choice of doing either one. I also can define different distribution shapes. So I've got all the standard distribution shapes, the triangular, uniform, trigen, normal, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got all these different shapes here that I can use to define what the impact is going to look like. Additionally, I can define what the cost impact of this is going to look like. So in this case, again, it's a relative impact, and I can define a different distribution for my cost impact. So it could be that this particular risk is going to cost me quite a bit of time, but it's not going to cost me as much in terms of cost, right? I'm going to have to stand down. I'm not going to be able to fly. So it's going to have a big impact on my schedule. It's going to have some impact on my cost, but relatively a smaller impact. Now I can define a pre-mitigated position for my risk. I can also define a post-mitigated position for my risk. So in that case, I can say, okay, when I do my mitigation strategies, and I can record the cost and impact of those mitigation strategies, and then I can record what my probability and impacts are going to look like post-mitigation. So in this case, post-mitigation, I've gone from 40% down to 10%. My impact is reduced from 100 to 165% down to 100 to 120%. So you can see that this mitigation strategy I've come up with is actually going to decrease the probability of occurrence and is also going to decrease the impact should it occur. And I do that for all of my risks and all of my uncertainties. So the idea here is I can go and I can put all of them here. And the real nice thing about this is I can assign multiple uncertainties to one activity. So in older tools like Primavera Risk Analysis, I always had trouble if I had multiple uncertainties associated with one activity. I would end up having to figure out myself what the combined impact of that would look like. But here I can put as many risks and uncertainties on any particular activity or cost line item that I need. Now, I talked earlier about calendar risks. So in this case, we've got a calendar risk where we've got a high wind, which is impacting our overall ability to fly. So again, we can look at this from the perspective of our pre-mitigated position. So in this case, we can say, okay, here's where it's likely to impact us. And you can see the percentages here. And also, we can again map these to our various activities. So the next thing is we've got our estimate uncertainty risks, and our estimate uncertainty risks work the same way as our standard risks, except they're 100% likely to occur, and I can choose one of them or one of the others. So in this case, I've got three of them, a low, medium, and high uncertainty. I can choose any one of them, but I can't choose multiples. So the big difference between an estimate uncertainty risk and a standard risk is I can choose as many standard risks as I want, but I can only choose one of the estimate uncertainty risks. And I'll show you that in the assignments in just a moment. All right, so now that I've basically got my risks all put together, now I can assign those risks to my costs and to my schedule. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk about the schedule side, and then I'm going to flip back later and I'm going to review the cost side and how we link the two together. But if we go to the risk mapping tab, I can see here a mapping grid, which essentially, again, I'm looking just at the schedule at this point. This allows me to choose any particular activity and define which of the risks are associated with that particular activity. So, for example, if I choose this agree contract, my risks are laid out across the top of the screen, and I can toggle these on or off. Now, you'll notice that there's a different shape to these assignment buttons. I actually have the first three columns, the first four columns is none, low, medium, high uncertainty. These are my estimate risks. And again, I can choose one of them, but I can only choose one of them. So I can toggle between the radio buttons and I can choose any one, but if I choose it, it immediately turns the other one off. To the right of that, I've got the square selection icons, and in here I can choose multiples. So here under agree contract, for example, I have a governance issue or a governance risk, and I also have a communication risk. Now, what I can see in here, if I just pull up the divider, is down the bottom of the screen, it will show me all of the risks that are associated with this particular activity. So you can see them here. We've got governance, e-communication, procurement delay, and we've got our low estimate uncertainty. And on the second tab, it will show me here's the distribution for each of those risks that you assigned, and here's the overall distribution on this activity. Now, this is really good because what it does is it allows me to go and um, turn these on and off, and I can see immediately what the distribution shape is going to look like. So if I had an activity that was, say, 30 days, and I inadvertently turned on an absolute risk of, say, 150 days, you would immediately see my distribution shape would get pushed way out to the right. So, I can immediately see if I've made a misassignment, and I can correct it immediately. And if I add another uncertainty, so maybe I'll go in here and I'll choose, say, contract or liquidation, which would definitely be a risk to my procurement, you can see immediately that this distribution shape changes. So again, as I add these, it's doing the overall combination, and this is how the activity will be modeled. So again, very powerful because I can see as I turn these on or off how my distribution shape changes. Okay, now once I've gone through and I've assigned this to all of my various activities, I basically have built my risk model from a schedule perspective. Again, I'm going to come back to costs in a couple of minutes. Now, one of the things that happens often with these things is I find that, I've got a lot of activities, I've got a lot of risks, things become difficult, and I do a lot of scrolling around. And that's always a problem when you're dealing with larger schedules and many risks. So the system helps me do that because it does let me put filters on. So I can actually go and do a risk filter on here. So maybe I just want to look at anything that has communication in it. So when I start typing that in, it's going to show me only the communication risks. This is external and internal communication risk. I can also put filters on my columns. So I can click on down and I can basically do smart filtering where I can choose individual items. The other thing that I can do, and I find this very useful, is if I put a filter on in my schedule screen, that filter will be carried across to my risk mapping screen. So again, if I want to assign a filter, for example, if I just say, okay, let me just see, say, design activities. So now I'm filtered down to just my design activities. When I go to my risk mapping, I will only also see my design activities. So again, if you're working with different blocks of uh, of your schedule, you don't necessarily need to look at all the engineering, all the procurement, all the construction, all the commissioning and startup in one massive screen. You can deal with it block by block by block. So again, very powerful and actually very sensible when you think about having to deal with larger schedules. I'm just going to turn the filter off. And I go back to my risk mapping. And now everything will be turned back on again. And let me just clear that filter out too. Okay. All right. So now that I've actually got my mappings done, now what I can do is I can go, and again, I'm going to come back to the cost section. Uh, time permitting, I'll go back to the correlation section as well. But now I can go to the Analyze tab. Now, the Analyze screen is obviously, first of all, where I set my options for how I'm going to do my analysis. But there's a couple of other really great features in here that make the tool very easy to use. And it's obviously designed by somebody who's done this kind of work because they've thought through some of these challenges. So the first thing is that I can turn risks on and off in my simulation just by clicking a checkbox. Right? So if I don't want to include, for example, a particular cost risk, and I don't want to include mergers and acquisitions or design specification changes, I can run the model with those risks turned off just by clearing the checkbox. The second thing that I can do is if they are turned on, I can tell the system that I want to use them in a pre-mitigated or post-mitigated position. So I don't have to go all pre-mitigated or all post-mitigated. To do the what if scenarios, I can actually toggle them and run some of them in the pre-mitigated position and some in the post-mitigated position. So again, it gives me a lot of flexibility to say, okay, if I can actually mitigate this risk, what does my model look like? So again, a lot of flexibility and a lot of power in the way that that works. Now, I also have the ability here to define focus activities. So perhaps in my uh, schedule, I've got a whole pile of stuff that doesn't really matter. So perhaps the key thing that I care about in my schedule is when do I turn this thing over to the owner? So when do I do my transfer of care, custody, and control, as we call it? I don't really care about all the demobilization activities and all the cleanup activities and all that other junk at the end of the schedule. What I really care about is those key activities that are deliverables that I have to achieve. So what I can do is I can create focus activities. So when I'm working the model, it will get me right to those activities rather than scrolling through and clicking on different activities and drilling down. I can just define up front, these are the activities I really care about. I can do the same thing with my cost model. Again, I'm going to come back to that, but I can also define items in my cost model that I really care about. So maybe I really care about um, manufacturing and I really care about engineering, but I don't care so much about legal costs, for example. So I can again define the things that I really care about and it'll help me focus on those when I go through the analysis. Now you can run either Monte Carlo or Latin hypercube sampling. You can choose to include or exclude correlations. You can resource level after each iteration. And you also have the ability to do step through, which I'm going to do now. So I'm going to click on run the analysis. Now, the system takes me back to the Gantt chart, and as I step through, I can see the impact of all my various risks on the model. So again, I can click through, I can scroll up and down to make sure that the model is moving the way I expect it to. So I have that capability in the system just to make sure everything's moving properly. And that's pretty standard. When I get bored of doing that, I can hit complete. And it takes me to a distribution graph. Again, this is pretty standard stuff. The thing about the distribution graph here is, again, I spoke earlier about my focus activities. I can click on that and just have a list of those focus activities that I care about in my schedule. Or if I want to, I can look at the entire schedule. And again, I can choose any point in that schedule. For example, maybe I want to see the distribution for the design phase of the project. And I can click on anywhere in my list of activities, and it will show me the results for those particular activities. Now, again, that filtering that I talked about back in the schedule module also carries through to here. So if I put a filter on to only look at construction activities or design activities, that filter will also show up here. I can also tell the system which percentiles I want to look at. In this case, there's like a pretty large number of percentiles turned on. Maybe I want to reduce that down to a smaller amount. I can do so by just clicking on the options and turning them off. So I can go in my focus percentiles. And here's all the ones that are defined. Maybe I don't need all of these. So what I could do is I could remove the ones I don't really care about. So perhaps I don't need to see P70, P80, and P90. So I could go and take my P80 value out and clean it up a little bit from that perspective. Now you can define as many of these as you like. Just very briefly, what for people perhaps who aren't that familiar with these distribution graphs, what this is telling me is that my deterministic finish date, which was November the 24th, is only about 5% likely to occur. If I want to give myself some confidence in my results, I need some contingency. So I need to get up to the 1st of January to get to 50%. I need to get to about another month after that, so the 8th of February to get to a 70%. And so I can see exactly where those are likely to end up based on the confidence level that I'm looking for. Now, I can look at those, of course, based on finish date. I can look at them based on start date. I can look at them based on duration. And of course, I can look at them based on cost, which we're going to come back to. Now, the next thing I can look at is, of course, I can look at my drivers. I can look at again, I'm looking at it entirely from a schedule perspective. We'll come back to costs in a few moments. But one of the advantages of having all of my risks and all of my uncertainties in one place is I can see which of the risks are actually driving my project. So I've got a tornado plot here, and I can see, for example, that the ash cloud is the risk that's having the biggest impact on my project. Now, when I go and look at the individual activities, which is what a lot of systems let you do, it's not that easy to look at all of these activities and understand which risk is actually driving these activities. But because all of my risks are in one place, everything can be tracked back to those risks. So I can see exactly which of the risks are driving my project, which is actually, in my opinion, more useful information than which activities are actually driving my overall end date. All right, so again, I can go and I can drill in any particular place in here. I can look at just my focus activities, but if I want to go down and pick an individual activity, again, it will show me the risks that are driving that particular activity as well. So you can see now that for assemble engine components, my design risk is the biggest risk on this particular activity. Now, that's all fine and great. I mean, when I look at this, I say, okay, if I'm looking at this particular activity, the tornado plot tells me that there's a 67% correlation between the design risk and the duration of this activity. There's a 41% between e-communication and this activity. So it's about 50% higher for design than it is for communication. Well, that's great, except that the project team never cares about percentage correlation. The project team wants to know what's the impact in terms of time. They don't really care about a number like 67% or 41%. They want to know what the impact is in days. So we can do that by the next tab, which is our sensitivity analysis tab. Now what that does is it allows us to do what I call analysis by exclusion. So what it's going to do is it's going to turn off the top risks one at a time and then rerun the analysis. And the idea is to understand how much of an impact each risk is having on the project. Now, I had a client a couple of years ago who used to do this manually in Primavera risk analysis. They would run the model, record the results, change the model to turn off the next risk, run the model again, store the results, change it, run the model again. And they told me it took them about a week to do this on a decent sized schedule. In this case, I can do this in a matter of a few seconds because I can tell the system to go ahead and run. Okay, I'm just going to turn off the options for a second. And what it tells me is overall, this is how much of an impact in terms of time each one of these risks is having on my schedule. So now I can go back to the project team and I can say, okay, that design specification risk is adding 47 days to the schedule. For flying conditions is adding 39 days to the schedule. So this allows me very quickly to give the answer to the scheduling team about how much of an impact an individual item is having. Now, I can also look at this from the perspective of an S curve. And again, if there's a lot of noise there, but let me just clear it for a second. I'll just turn them on one at a time. So first of all, let's look at the none. So this is with all of our risks turned on. Here's what the model looks like. We can choose the percentage that we care about. In this case, it's set for P90, but I can set it to something else. We'll leave it at P90 for now. But then what I can do is I can say, okay, if I can get the design risk turned off, what does my curve look like? If I can get poor flying conditions turned off, what does my profile look like? And I've even got one down here, which is an opportunity that says, okay, if I turn off the opportunity, what does my shape look like? So it allows me to see very quickly how much of a direct impact each of these risks is having on my overall project. Now, I can also tell the system that I want to do this on a multiple pass approach. And what the system will do is it will actually go through and it will turn them off together. So it'll turn off the first risk and then turn off also the second risk and then also the third highest risk, also the fourth highest risk, for example, and it will show me the cumulative saving. It takes a little bit more time to run that, but the idea is sometimes these risks are somewhat interrelated, and turning off one would reduce the savings of turning off the next one. So it allows me to do that kind of analysis as well. Okay, so we've talked about um, the schedule analysis. Now I'm going to step back a little bit. I'm going to talk about the cost risk analysis. So I'm going to go to the cost tab. Now, when we first started talking years ago about the value of having an integrated cost and schedule risk model, the only way that people could effectively do that was to actually go and build a resource loaded schedule and run the risk analysis on that. Now that can be done, but it's a lot of work. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time, and it's very difficult to take items that aren't schedule related, the costs that aren't schedule related, and build them into that model. So, while we could do it, we could put costs on milestones, or we could put them on hammocks, or we could do all kinds of different things. The reality was it was a lot of work, and you were kind of trying to force that square peg into the round hole. It can be done, but it's painful. So Safran said, okay, let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's say we're going to build a cost model with its own risks. And then what we're going to do is we're going to determine how much of that cost model is schedule related and how much is not. So let's just look first of all at the cost model. I'm just going to turn off the schedule section here for a moment. All right, so in the cost model, I have my cost breakdown structure here. It's a hierarchy, and I've built in here a number of line items, and the overall cost for this, or deterministic cost for this particular project, is $8.1 million. Now, I can put uncertainties on that cost estimate, just a base uncertainty. So I can go in here and say, okay, in this case, my additional parts is $300,000, but it could be as little as $240,000 or as much as $450,000. So I can just put a base uncertainty in there, but I can also get quite a bit more sophisticated, because what I can do is I can actually go in and I can assign those risks from my project risks tab that are cost related to any of my particular cost line items. So for example, if additional parts might be required due to design errors, for example, I can turn that risk on. Now, what the system is going to do is it's going to go and take those items, the part supply cost risk and the design risk, and it's going to assign those to that line item. Now, just like I saw in the schedule side, I can see what the impact of that is going to look like by going down to the uh, risks. So there's the two risks that are assigned to my particular line item. I can go to the impact, and again, just like I saw on the schedule activities, I can see the cumulative impact of those risks on my cost profile. So again, in this case, we can say the deterministic cost was 300,000. The mean cost is about 550,000. That's that gray line there. So here's what my distribution shape looks like with these risks associated. So that's all great, because now what I've got is I've got an independent cost model, and I can put formulas and everything else in here. We don't really have time to do a super deep dive into this, but I can put formulas with uncertainties around resource rates and quantities and all that sort of thing in here as well. Um, but here's where the real kind of party trick comes in when it comes to Safran risk. I can tell the system that some or all of these costs are linked to my schedule. So right now I've got a schedule model and I've got a cost model. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie them together. So I'm just going to turn on the columns to show the schedule linking. Put this dialog box on the screen so you can see it. So I'm going to turn on the schedule section. Now the idea here is that I can choose any of these line items, and what I can do is I can link those to my schedule. Now the way that I do that is I can click here in the activity section, and I can choose an activity that I want to link to my to my cost item. So in this case, for example, let me find the appropriate activity here. I'll just choose this one down here. Okay, so what I can do is I can take this line item and I can tell the system it's linked to this activity, and then I tell the system what percentage of that cost is linked to the activity. So when I'm working in here, I might say, you know what, not all of the costs in this line item are linked to an activity. Maybe only 50% or only 60% are schedule related. The other ones are fixed costs because they relate to parts that I'm going to buy and they're going to sit there, and it doesn't really matter if the schedule takes longer. But I can put a number in here like say 50%, say okay. And now what the system does is says, okay, you had a $590,000 line item, 295,000 of that is linked to your schedule. Now, what it does then is it says, okay, you've linked those to the schedule, then it calculates a day rate based on the duration of that activity in the schedule. And now as the activity in the schedule starts changing, the day rate is going to stay fixed, and what's going to happen is I'm going to end up with the costs being distributed over time. So if the activity goes long, my costs are going to go up. If the activity goes short, my costs are going to go down. So again, this is giving me the ability to link or unlink things. Now I can link to a regular activity, or I can link to a hammock activity. If I have a high level activity, I can do that. And I can link to more than one activity. So in this case here, with this assembly resources, I've got two activities. I've got 50% of the costs associated with one of them and 10% associated with another one. So in my cost model, I've got a whole bunch of moving parts here. So I've got this linked to my activities. I've got a base uncertainty on it. I've got it linked to my risks. And I've got my formulas around things like resource rates and things like that built in here as well. So I have a lot of moving parts in this cost model that will help me get a more accurate picture of where my costs are likely to end up. Now, if I scroll way over to the right, there's a column available that'll show me, and let me add it here. It's called iteration value. And what iteration value shows me is when I start running through my analysis, it's going to show me what the cost of this line item was in each iteration as I stepped through the analysis. So I'm going to go back to my Analyze tab. I'm going to do a step through again. I'm going to click Run Analysis. But now instead of stepping through on the schedule Gantt, I'm going to go to the Cost module. And here you can see this column starts to change as I step through. So the other thing that it does is it changes the color of the risks that are firing during this iteration. So as you see, as I step through, you can see the colors change as the risks fire or don't fire. And also the iteration value is changing. So my base uncertainty is going, my activities are changing in duration, my risks are firing, and here's the result overall. And if I scroll all the way up to the top, I've got this iteration was 9.6 million, which is quite an increase from my original 8.1, I think 8.2 as my original deterministic value. And as I keep stepping through, there's an 11 million, another 9 million, 8 million. So it's jumping around significantly, based on all of those inputs that I've built into the cost model. All right, so I don't want to spend too much more time here. I'm just going to hit complete. Now, I've run the analysis. Let's go and look at our results. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my histogram on a cost basis. So rather than on a schedule basis, I'm now looking at it on a cost basis. Keep in mind that all those inputs from the schedule are in this model. So I can say, here's where I'm likely to end up. My P70 value is just about exactly $10 million, up from my deterministic value of $8.15 million. Now I can do all the same things I did before. I can go to my drivers, and again, going to cost, I can see which of the risks are the big drivers of my overall project risk. Now, again, just like we had focus activities, we have our focus costs. So we can go in and choose the individual items. For example, we can say, what are the risks that are driving my transportation? Well, the big one here is this cost item for air transport required. Probably not a big surprise. If I have to start shipping things by air, my costs are going to go through the roof. So again, I've got the ability to drill in and look at those individual items. Or I can again look at the overall or any particular line item by drilling down into my structure and choosing that particular line item. I also can do my sensitivity analysis. So this time what I'm going to do, instead of looking at this on a schedule basis, again, I'm going to look at it on a cost basis. And I'm going to turn all of these on again. So again, I can see what are the items that are having a big impact from a cost perspective. So in this case, there's a big cost saving with outsource, but then I can see down below what are the things that are having a negative impact. So again, parts supply is having a huge impact on my overall cost. And again, if I can get rid of that risk, I can save myself about $1.6 million on my overall project. Okay, so we've talked about the schedule risk analysis. We've talked about the cost risk analysis and how we tie the two together. We've looked at some of the outputs. But here's the thing that everybody wants to see. So in our analysis, people say, okay, I want a P70 confidence level. And I want a P70 confidence level on my cost. And I want a P70 confidence level on my schedule. But the reality is that I'm not going to get a combined 70% confidence by choosing 70% on each of them. So in the system, the scatter plot, now because I've got my cost and schedule all together, I can see where I'm likely to end up. So let me just flip this back to, first of all, let's look at the deterministic values. All right, so in this scatter plot, it's showing me down here that my deterministic, or what we call our joint confidence level for my deterministic value is coming in at, what is this? It's around, well, basically close to 0%. So it's basically coming in at a really low number. Now, the system is putting my confidence levels in colored bands here. So if I want a joint confidence level of 70%, where I need to be is right on the borderline between my orange band, which is 50 to 70, and my red band, which is 70 to 90. So I'm looking for these dots in this area here. Now, what's interesting about this is that to get a joint confidence level of 70%, I actually have what we call a continuum of points. So any of these points represent 70%, right? So there's a curve here that you can see, and anywhere on this curve represents 70%. So for example, if I were to put in um, my finish date um, of around, say, um, say sometime in March. So I go in, let's say March 18th, and on my, actually, let's make that March 25th, a week later. And if I put my cost in as 10.5 million, okay, so that gives me a point which is right around 70%. So you can see there if I hover my cursor there, come on up. Okay, so that's putting me right at 70%. Okay, now the reality is on this project, I could spend more money to save some time, which would mean moving up the curve this way. And at some point, I end up spending so much money and saving no time that this line becomes vertical, and I just can't get there. However, I may also say, you know what? Maybe time isn't the most important thing. Maybe budget's more important, in which case I could choose any point on this curve moving down. And again, at some point, you can give as much time as you want and you save no cost. But in this area here, I've got some options. So for example, I could say, okay, maybe time to market's the most important thing to me. So really what I want is I don't mind spending a bit more money to save some time. So maybe I'm going to choose this point up here, which says, okay, if I spend $11 million, I could finish around the 12th of March. So I'm going to save myself a couple of weeks by spending $500,000. Now I can decide if that's worth doing or not worth doing as a project team. So again, rather than just pick a P70 cost and a P70 date, now I can look at the JCL, the joint confidence level, and say, this is what I'm looking at overall. All right, one more thing before I stop talking and people can ask questions. We also have a probabilistic cash flow. So the probabilistic cash flow allows you to, again, based on the cost model and the dates that you've assigned either directly to the costs or through the schedule link, to actually determine when you're likely to spend your money on this project. Now, again, because I've got a link between my schedule and my costs, I can come up with this um, probabilistic cash flow to look at when I'm likely to be spending the money on the project. Now, this is quite important for people because oftentimes on a large project, they want to be spending a certain amount of money each year, and you need to look at whether that's likely to happen or not likely to happen. Um, so again, what we can do in the system is we have the ability to go in and turn on all kinds of different columns and all kinds of different data. In this case, I've dumbed it down a little bit to look at, here's my deterministic cash flow, and here's my P70 cash flow. So here's where I think I'm going to spend my money on the project. Okay, let me flip back. Okay, so some of the people around the world that are using Safran Risk, there's a bunch of different clients, and we're adding clients all the time. Um, there's a lot of excitement around this tool because of that integrated cost and schedule modeling. Um, at this point, I'll open it up for questions. I see there's a couple questions in here already. If you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in and I'll work through the list. So the first question was, in the project risk tab, which is the risk event and uncertainty range? Okay, so the difference between a risk event and an uncertainty, let me go back to project risks. I think that's the question you're asking. If it's not, you can let me know. So anything that's an uncertainty is going to have 100% probability of occurrence. We also have the estimate uncertainties, but anything that's a risk event is going to have a number less than 100%. So in this case, the ash cloud would be a risk event. It has a 40% probability of occurrence. And the way that the system models that essentially is I can put both of them in the same place, but an uncertainty has typically 100% likelihood of occurrence. Um, the next question was, since we can model the cost with schedule dependency, can the driver show which schedule dependencies drives the cost? Yeah, so you can show which of the, if you go back to the drivers, we can actually go to the activities tab on the costs and see which of the activities are having the largest impact on our cost. So down the bottom here, we've got our risks, our activities, our costs, or everything all together. So you can separate out that and see which of the activities are having the biggest impact on our cost model. Um, I, somebody said the screen had frozen. I'm not sure anybody else has seen that. But my preview looked like it was working okay. Um, could I talk about storing scenarios? Yeah, so the idea here is when I actually put these together, I can actually, because it's all in one database, it's very easy for me to turn things on and off and change the way it's structured. By when I go to my Analyze tab, I have the ability to turn things on and off. Now, when I run those, what I can do is I can then make a copy in the database of that scenario if I want to. Typically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be toggling between those scenarios, and it only takes a second to make the changes and rerun them. But if you want to store the scenarios, because this is all sitting in a SQL Server database, you can make copies with those scenarios, those options turned on and off, and they're all in one place. Could you set up a cost estimate template in something like Excel to be imported? Yeah, absolutely. One of the best things about Safran is the ability to import and export from Excel. And in fact, that's what I do all the time. So I will take this and I can, for example, I can export this out to Excel. All of the fields and everything, all the mappings and everything that are in here will all be in that export file. So if you're working in an estimating tool and you just want to take the results and you want to put those results in here, absolutely you can do that through Excel. Um, our start to finish activities, an issue for Safran risk? No, they're not. They're not even really a problem in Primavera risk analysis. It's just that they're such a quirky thing that people find them confusing and try to avoid them. They don't actually break the model, even in Primavera, but they're just complicated and hard for people to get their heads around. And generally speaking, if somebody puts one in, oftentimes it's a mistake. But yeah, we do support them if you want to use them. Um, does the tool lend itself to being able to learn from past projects? Um, there isn't a lessons learned module per se, uh, but there you do have the ability to go back and review like anything else. Safran does have a qualitative risk tool that is either just come to market or just about to come to market, which would probably be a better solution for things like past histories. Um, Is it possible to save the model that you build, including analysis results? So the way the system does this is everything's saved in the database as I go. The only thing that isn't saved is the results that come out. So when I actually run the analysis, if I close out of Safran and I come back in, the settings will all be the same, but I need to rerun the analysis, which will generate the distribution graph and all the rest of it. But all the inputs to the risk are all stored in the database. So it's very quick to just go back in and rerun the analysis to get the results again. Anything that you save, by the way, to the distribution comparison does get stored in the system. So I didn't talk about that, but if you have different models that you want to compare, you can do so. Um, can I run Monte Carlo simulations only with absolute risk values in Safran? Um, yes, you can. So if you want to just put in just some absolute values, yeah, you can. So um, uh, you should be able to do that. Just put the absolute distribution on the risk, and then associate the risk to a zero line item in the cost model, and you should be able to get that to work. Um, my project schedule only has 22 activities. Yeah, you're right. In a mega project with thousands of activities, how would I suggest you model that? Well, I'm going to avoid the question of how many activities you should have for best as a best practice, because that's always a thorny question, and we don't have time to talk about that today. But um, in my experience, what I found, and I've done this a long time, in Primavera risk analysis, performance starts to drop off at about 2,500 activities. In Safran, I found that I've been able to run 10,000 activity schedules with no real issue. And just for the hell of it, I ran one 35,000 activity schedule. And although the system slowed down a little bit, it still worked, and it still worked quite well. So I'm quite comfortable to say that it can handle very large schedules. Um, Assumptions are important. So is there a way to capture these? Usually I have to document or record them somewhere else. So for that, I would again point you to Safran Risk Manager, which is their new tool, which is more on the qualitative side, where you can capture all of the assumptions and everything around the risks. I don't. I Like you, I typically end up doing those things in Excel. You do have the ability in the project risks to record things like comments and things, so you can actually put in information that you want to store. Um, but again, I'm not sure. Like, there's a notes section down the bottom, but I'm not sure whether that's going to be enough for what you're looking for. And I would point you to Safran Risk Manager for that. Um, can correlation be assigned to event existence as well as impact? Yes. So we have a correlation section here that I don't typically cover in these because we always run out of time. But in here, you can actually map risks to each other. So the probability, the impact on schedule, and the impact on cost. So you have the ability in here to correlate your risks together, which is actually a much better way, in my opinion, than going and trying to map activities or cost line items together. So again, because we build everything on the idea of the risks, we can correlate the risks together, which to me is a much more effective way of doing that. So yes, we can apply a correlation that links the existence or the probability and also the impacts. Am I using a cost loaded schedule? In this case, no, I'm not. So the cost model is independent of the schedule, but I've linked the two together. Um, I have used cost loaded schedules in the past, and you can do it. It's just a lot of work. And generally speaking, people have gotten away from it because it's just too much work. Okay. I think that's it for questions. If there's any more, I can take them. If you do have a question, you can fire it into the question section. Um, yeah, and as I'm, Chris raised a good point. I'm talking through these things, and I'm clicking on my screen, but I am not sharing my screen while I answer questions, which is my bad. Let me go back to my screen share for the questions. I apologize for that. Um, so real quick, I'll go back to a couple of the questions that I had before. There was a question about um, about turning these things on and off, and do they get stored? So again, whatever you said in here does get stored. Um, the other question was about, let me see, let me go through them real quick here and see which ones I missed. Okay, so when I go back to my risk mappings, sorry, my project risks, the ones that have the probability of less than 100% are the ones which are risk events. Um, for the cost risks, um, let's go back to the drivers tab. So on the drivers tab for the cost risks, again, I can click on this and look at it from the perspective of activities. rather than from the perspective of my risks. So I have these tabs at the bottom of the screen, and I can toggle between them. So I can look at the risks impacting my cost model, or I can look at the activities which are impacting my cost model. Um, okay, so export and import from Excel was the other one. I was clicking through these and blindly, no one was looking, no one was seeing anything. So again, I can import and export to Excel from my cost model. So using these two features here, and when I've got them in Excel, they're very easy to work with. Um, Start finish activities I talked about. Okay, I guess we can save the model. Okay, so correlation, let me go back to that one really quickly. So for correlation, again, I can impact the probabilities and I can of my risks. I can also correlate the impacts of my risks. Okay. Next question was, our project is cost built from resources. We'd like to use the cost and make risks affect cost and duration independent mode. Saffron default is the cost depends on duration. Okay, so if you're if you're using um, a resource loaded schedule, which I think is what you're saying you want to do, you can build a resource loaded schedule in Safran Risk, and you can do the analysis on that. I would be inclined to do it through the cost model and link it to the schedule, and then you can choose which of the things are duration dependent and which are duration independent. You can still build a cost from resources if you want to do that. So you can do it. You can do it either way. Um, there's a question: how easy is it to utilize hammocks for costs? It's actually quite easy because when I'm working in my cost model, I can assign a hammock activity when I actually go to my activity section. If I have a hammock activity, I can just go ahead and I can choose that hammock activity. I'm not sure I have any in here, but I can just choose a hammock activity and use that. Now, um, again, that's pretty typical because you end up with a lot of costs like hotel costs and things like that, which are spread over a period of time. So you have that ability to link to hammock activities just like any other activity. Can you define the cost distributions from the Excel template as well as the base costs? Yeah, absolutely. So not only can I import just the cost model, but all of the risks associated with that cost model can be imported from Excel. And in fact, the risks themselves can also be imported and exported through Excel. So again, the system is very good from the perspective of interoperability and getting information in and out using Excel. All right, we're a little over time. I hope I've answered all the questions. I'll give people one more chance. In the meantime, I'll go back to my slides. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. My contact information is here. Um, uh, so again, if you have any specific questions or you'd like to talk about how Safran Risk approaches a particular problem or Safran Risk versus PRA, I can answer those questions. I've actually written a series of blogs on that are available on Safran's site, which talk about why I think people should be upgrading now from Primavera Risk Analysis to Safran. Um, so those are available on Safran's site if you'd like to take a look at those. And actually, Safran has a really great guided learning path structure to their site, which is a really useful way to learn about the tool and understand all the features that they've added to the tool. Okay. There's a couple more questions I'll talk about. This time I'll make sure I actually turn on my screen share. Okay, can I elaborate more about the estimate uncertainty? Yeah, so the estimate uncertainty is essentially intended to be used when you have a range of uncertainties. So the idea is that I could say this particular activity or cost line item is low, medium, or high uncertainty. So when I define a uncertainty as an estimate uncertainty, when I go to the risk mapping tab, you can see all of those um, estimate uncertainties are grouped to the left, and I can only choose one of them. So rather than select a checkbox, I get a radio button. So for example, if I look at maybe this agree contract, it's set as a low uncertainty. If I wanted to make it say a high uncertainty, I could toggle it to high uncertainty, which would change my distribution shape, obviously. But um, but when I do that, you see that the low uncertainty disappears. So I can only choose one of these. And the idea behind this is that when you're dealing with just those uncertainties, you're not going to want to choose multiples for estimate uncertainties. You're only going to choose one of them. Now, the difference then if with between that and a line item, which is a 100% um, uh, which is a 100% probability here, I mean, I could model this the same way, except that if I made a low, medium, and high uncertainty all with 100%, I could choose more than one of them. So I could choose low and medium and high, perhaps inadvertently, on the same activity or cost line item. So the idea here is with the estimate uncertainties, it allows me to say it's low or medium or high or none, not two or three of them all at the same time. So that's really the difference between those. Um, Next question, is there anything that PRA does that Safran cannot do? That's a good question. Um, so um, the one thing that Safran does not do is it does not allow me to do branching logic. Now there is a workaround for it that you can do, but it's a bit convoluted. Um, but that is coming in Safran, so it is coming in a future release of Safran because PRA users are asking for that. Bit random, but what's your favorite feature of Safran? Ooh, that's a good question. I think my favorite feature of Safran is the way that the project risks are handled. And the reason for that is I used to always struggle when I had multiple uncertainties on one activity in PRA. So maybe I have three or four different uncertainties. I'm uncertain about the soil conditions. I'm uncertain about the productivity of my piling crew. I'm uncertain about weather conditions, for example, and all three of those uncertainties need to be applied to my piling activity. And I would have to say, okay, what's the overall distribution shape going to look like? Well, now the beauty of Safran is I define them all just as uncertainties, and then in the risk mapping, I can choose as many uncertainties as I want. So the system will do all of that for me. So that makes things a whole lot easier when you're trying to build a model. So that's probably my favorite feature. A close second would be the joint confidence level mapping. I think this is really powerful, and this is what a lot of people want to see. Um, so it's become a big deal. It's considered best practice to look at your JCL as opposed to just your probability of achieving your cost goals and achieving your schedule goals. We really want to know, like, our project isn't successful if we're on time but over budget, and it's not successful if we're late but on budget. We need to look at both, and we need to understand where we're going to be at on that curve. And I think that the ability to analyze that is huge. In fact, there's a great presentation that was done at AACE conference a couple of years ago when we could all still go to conferences that talked about choosing the best point in this curve and how do you do that. And it was a great presentation by a guy named Sam Steinman. If you're interested, I've got a copy of it, and Sam's is happy to have it distributed. So if you are interested in that, let me know and I'll send you a copy of it. But it was a great, very interesting presentation that he did about how on Department of Energy projects, they look at that curve and choose what is the best point in that curve for the project. All right, I think that's it for questions. If there's any other questions that you have, again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to I'm happy to answer any questions. And if I can't answer it, I'm sure somebody at Safran can, and I'll help you get the right answer or get an answer anyway. All right. Well, we're 15 minutes over time. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. Um, and we will be in touch.